Hi, and welcome to another sneak peek Saturday at the Alameda Free Library. My name is Jenny, and today I am going to read you some nonfiction, and it is called Boomers, the Men and Women Who Promised Freedom and Delivered a Disaster. Nice cover though, isn't it? The book is written by Helen and again, you see the yellow sticker right here. You can find this book in our news section. I'm gonna read you the flap and then we're just gonna start with the first chapter. With 2 recessions and a botched pandemic under their belt, the boomers are their children's favorite punching bag. But is the hatred justified? Is the destruction left in their wake their fault or simply the luck of the generational draw? In Boomers, essayist Helen addresses the boomer legacy with scrupulous fairness and biting wit. Following the model of Lytton Strachey's Eminent Victorians, she profiles 6 of the boomers' brightest and best. She shows how Steve Jobs tried to liberate everyone's inner rebel but unleashed our stultifying digital world of social media and the gig economy. How Aaron Sorkin played Pied Piper to a generation of idealistic wrongs, how Camille Paglia corrupted academia while trying to save it, how Jeffrey Sachs, Al Sharpton, and Sonia Sotomayor wanted to empower the oppressed but ended up empowering new oppressors. Ranging far beyond the usual Beatles and Bill Clinton cliches, Andrews shows how these 6 boomers' effect on the world has been tragically, and often ironically, contrary to their intentions. She reveals the essence of boomerness. They tried to liberate us, and instead of freedom, they left behind chaos. Well, it's very promising. All right. So first chapter is called just plain The Boomers. The baby boomers were born between 1945 and 1964. In the era of prosperity and self-confidence that followed America's victory in World War II. Excuse me. The same spirit of optimism and good fortune that boosted the birth rate in those years gave those children a lifelong sense that the world was made just for them. Like the Victorians, the boomers have been a dominant cohort with influence beyond the normal generational allotment. Each passing decade of the 20th century has been defined by what the boomers were doing during it. Watching TV in the suburbs in the 1950s, rocking and rebelling in the 1960s, taking things too far in the 70s, buckling down and making money in the 1980s. This kaleidoscope of stereotyped images shows not America passing from one generation to another, but a single generation moving from one phase of life to the next. The boomers are far more self-obsessed than the Victorians were, but even if they were as humble as lambs, they would still have loomed large over the 20th century due to sheer numbers. Since they came of age, they have been America's largest voting bloc, the largest advertising demographic, the most important readers, drivers, diners, concert goers. They were dominant in their youth when their elders flattered their idealism and advertisers chased their dollars, and they clung tenaciously to their dominance for the next half century. Bob Dylan's receiving the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2016 might have made a nice capstone to this era of overwhelming boomer supremacy, the apotheosis of their global takeover, after which they might have made a graceful exit and let the younger generations have their rightful day, or late afternoon, on the cultural stage. This graceful exit has not yet been observed. The Rolling Stones will stop touring first. Unsurprisingly, the boomers' children have grown to resent them as much as the Lytton strategy resented the Victorians. But is it more than resentment? A poll of millennials taken in 2018 found that a majority believed boomers had made things worse for their generation. What could they be referring to? The boomers have started no world wars, conscripted no soldiers, launched no bread lines. There's nothing in their record to compare with the pile of corpses at Passchendaele. The only fields of poppies planted on their account have been in Kandahar, not memorially. Nevertheless, the millennials are right. The baby boomers have been responsible for the most dramatic sundering of Western civilization since the Protestant Reformation. If that is hard to accept, it is only because the boomer revolution has been so comprehensive that it has become almost impossible to imagine what life was like before it. The rise of television, for example, has altered the human mind as much as the printing press did. And one of the ways it has been to make sustained concentration virtually impossible for those raised in its atmosphere, the way a third dimension is unthinkable for the inhabitants of Flatland. The result has been generations of young people who lack a grounding in the basic facts of history, which can't possibly be absorbed by video. To cover their tracks even further, the boomers have stuffed their ears with sufficient pseudo knowledge to make them feel as if they know enough about the past to judge themselves superior to it. Before the Renaissance, would-be rediscoverers of Aristotle were sometimes told by zealous churchmen that anything written before Christ was ipso facto not worth rediscovering. This is approximately how the boomers feel about themselves. Any suggestion that the Western world might not be altogether better off for their influence is immediately met with an indignant litany of all the segments of humanity who previously labored in a sad state of abject non-personhood before the boomers came along and broke their chains. So deeply ingrained is this sentiment that even the boomers' harshest critics always hasten to add their reassurances that they would not want to undo the least particle of the legacy of the 1960s, only temper its excesses. I am sympathetic to this line of argument to a point. As a woman, if I had been born in another country, my schooling might well have stopped at age 12. On the other hand, in this age, I attended some of the best schools in the world until I was 21 and still didn't receive an education that those benign eras would have considered standard. Is this necessarily an improvement? In order to attempt an impartial appraisal of their legacy, it may be necessary to bracket the boomers, conversation-stopping claims to be mankind's greatest liberators for at least a preliminary moment. Though this is like asking a medieval theologian to bracket the incarnation. Boomers have never hesitated to make themselves look better by massaging the historical record. So a good place to start an examination of their achievements is with a clear-eyed look at how life has changed in the last 70 years. People who claim to be liberators often exaggerate how bad things were before they came along, in order to make their achievements seem greater, or in cases where their so-called liberation unleashes dark forces they did not anticipate. They pretend that things have always been this bad. Boomers do a bit of both, so it is useful to put their self-flattering narrative through a fact check. For all their claims to be women's greatest liberators, it would be hard to convince an impartial observer that boomer feminism has left women better off when 1 in 5 white women are on antidepressants. Feminism for the boomers mostly meant channeling women into paid employment on an unprecedented scale. Women have always worked, but never in American history did women outnumber men in the labor force until January 2020. Boomers promised that employment was the only way for women to be fulfilled and independent, when any socialists could have told them that there is no one more dependent than a wage worker. You didn't have to be a socialist to guess that 1970s feminism wasn't going to work out well. Just a decent observer of the psychology of the leading feminist. Betty Friedman was a self-obsessed malcontent who deliberately concealed her past as a fellow traveler of the Communist Party USA, in order to make the feminine mystique seem like an honest memoir and not political propaganda. Gloria Steinem had good personal reasons for considering the nuclear family a trap. Her father was a ne'er-do-well hustler, practically a con man, and her fragile mother spent long stretches of her life institutionalized, both before and after their divorce. This gave young Gloria such an abhorrence of domesticity that in her first 2 decades as a political organizer, she never spent longer than 8 days at home before setting off on the road again. That is not how most women want to live. Friedan claimed to have been alerted to the problem that has no name by a 1957 Smith's alumni questionnaire that showed her fellow members of the class 1942 languishing in suburban misery, but she misrepresented the survey's findings. It actually showed that most respondents were satisfied with their marriages, felt perfectly free to work outside the home if they wanted to, most didn't, and generally had never been happier. Polls of suburban housewives in the 1960s found that compared with their working counterparts, they were more likely to report reading widely and to feel that they were using their educations in their daily lives. Making life easier for atypical women is a laudable goal. Florence Nightingale was an atypical woman, and even the stuffy old Victorians were grateful that she had the freedom to become eminent enough for Lytton Strachey to write about. But the net effect of boomer feminism has been to restrict the choices of typical women, taking the choice that was making most of them happy and removing it from the set of options. When married women entered the workforce in large numbers, it bid up the price of basic middle-class necessities like housing and education until by the 1990s, families were working twice as hard to be no better off than they were when most households had a single earner. Intellectual stimulation would be small compensation for the demands of this harried lifestyle. But most of these women don't even have that. They are not journalists like Stranham and Friedan. They have jobs, not careers. 1 in 5 white women on antidepressants and 1 in 6 of all Americans on some kind of psychiatric medication. This would not have been possible without the boomer era's broader embrace of mind-altering drugs. It is hard to say which is sadder, the number of people who have overdosed on heroin or the number permanently fuzzing their emotional perception of the universe because they were once sad enough to pop a positive on a PHQ-9. Most depressive episodes end on their own within 6 to 8 months. Prescriptions, unfortunately for patients, but fortunately for the manufacturers of Wellbutrin, last indefinitely. It is interesting to note how closely drugs have tracked the boomers as their needs and tastes have changed with age. Marijuana gave way to cocaine when they became old and rich enough to prefer the champagne of drugs, as the New York Times called it in 1974. On the legal side, the fad of Ritalin conveniently arose at exactly the right time to make the boomers' school-age children easier to manage. This mass resort to psychotropics has been closed in the most nauseating sanctimony from drug dealers no less than from mental health professionals. The new left historian Todd Gitlin insists in his pioneering history of the 1960s that Bay Area acid kings like Augustus Owsley Stanley III were not in it just for the money. They kept their prices down, gave out plenty of free samples, and fancied themselves dispensers of miracles at the service of a new age. The truth is that Stanley, like a lot of silver spoon screw-ups, simply did not think very much about turning a profit. Others after him would. The last barrier between the dealers and the real money, Adderall money, Zoloft money, was the lingering taboo that made making money of recreational dope somehow not respectable. With the former Speaker of the House, John Brunner, born in 1949, making marijuana legalization his retirement project, we may live to see the day when the street dealers' pharmacopoeia is covered by Medicaid, at which point the boomer drug revolution will be complete. This is where I'm going to stop. I find this very interesting. I don't know a whole lot about it. And if you do neither, I recommend you check out this book. Again, it is called Boomers by Helen Andrews. Again, you can find it in the new section in the library, and I suggest placing a hold on it if you want to make sure that the book is available when you want to come get it. Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed this, like always. I see you again next Saturday. Bye.